thank you so much, and thank you for those from the UK. Welcome, and I'm really honoured to have such an international audience. I do want to start with thanking Carol Willis for inviting me to speak at the Skyscraper Museum. This museum has been really instrumental in my work for the last 10 years, because it's been such a crucible of ideas about how we live in cities, what is the implication of living in a high-rise, what is the future of dense cities. And the work I do particularly is, I'm really interested in movement. I'm a dancer and a theater person by training, so my interest in cities is about how humans occupy built environments. And I come from a family of architects, so we're always having arguments about, architectural sort of auteur signature buildings, and from my perspective, sort of how are those spaces being used, and what are the social and kinetic implications of those spaces. So a lot of my work has come out of the nexus of sort of thinking about dense cities, coming from a very small town in Africa called Dar es Salaam, a coastal city, and really being confronted over the last 20 years in New York City with this extraordinary transformation within 20 years, from sort of the city, sort of Giuliani city to Bloomberg city to de Blasio city. This is a massive, extreme makeover from sort of disaster city to recovery city to futuristic city. So all this has been greatly explored at the Skyscraper Museum, and so I'm just really excited to be here, but also because I think this is the right place to ask certain kinds of questions. Carol did a conference a couple of years ago, I don't know if it was 2009, it was a conference of Hong Kong, New York. And I found that conference really central to some of the questions in Fluid New York, because when I came to New York, I came from an Indian city, Bangalore, and my parents live in a coastal city called Cochin, which is the tip of India, but I was born in Dar es Salaam, so I had a history of cities, and I'd been familiar with different kinds of what I would call walking cities. But coming to New York, I was fascinated that somehow in New York there's a culture of really taking walking cities seriously. I mean, people care about the fact they walk in New York. So I got really interested in this idea of what does it mean to live in cities, and why do New Yorkers think they're particularly exceptional because they live in New York? Because I'd always lived in a city. I'd lived in California for about 7 years, and LA and Santa Barbara and San Francisco, and there's people live in these cities, but they're not ready to die for their city. At least I never met people who were willing to die for their city in Santa Barbara, mostly because they were medicated probably. But in any case, I came to New York and I was fascinated by this city that was a neighborhood city, the city of the Lower East Side, the small gardens, the city of where I live, Jane Street. People are really peculiar on Jane Street. They particularly care about what lies on their street. So Fluid New York really emerged out of this kind of thinking about what in the conference on Hong Kong and New York was raised, which is the future of cities is that there's going to be more and more dense cities, and there's going to be enormous amounts of sort of sprawl, as sort of this kind of dichotomy between density and sprawl. And the question then is, what kinds of lifestyles are people going to inhabit? Particularly in Asia, people are looking at some of the mega cities in Asia. In the 1930s, New York was the densest city in the world. But at this point in time, it's sort of 15th in terms of density in the world. I may be wrong here, maybe 17th, something like that. But it's no longer the tallest city in the world. It's no longer the densest. It's no longer the, it's catching up architecturally, but till sort of the last 5 years, New York was not any more renowned for its particularly new, interesting buildings. It's been really focusing on changing that opinion about itself. And so you have this incredibly dramatic high-line sort of star architecture kind of pathway now. But the question to me was that, but what can we learn from New York today? Is there anything in the city which was so interesting in the 1930s? It was the city of the future then. What can we learn from the city today? And so my work of the last 20 years of really wandering through the city and losing myself in the city in the sort of a Walter Benjamin sort of way, and being a mom in the city, hanging out with my friends in different parks, like Jane Jacobs did. She had 3 kids here. And so this was the city I started to write about. And in the time I was writing about the city, Giuliani, who was he was the mayor with the baton. And he went around, kind of cleaning up the city, and it was a different kind of city under him. It was the city that made you nervous if you jaywalked. But he was, so there was this very distinct kind of city that he created. And then Bloomberg came along, and it was nice if you were rich under Bloomberg, because things got a little nicer in your neighborhoods. But if you weren't so well-heeled, things weren't so perhaps as as comfortable. So that city of Bloomberg's, though, was very interesting because there were many different greening efforts made under Bloomberg that were sort of very tangible and tactile, that had begun under Giuliani, and Bloomberg's era, it sort of began to fruition. So the city that I began to write about was a city of transformation, because the first draft of this book was finished in 1999, and 2000, and then the buildings fell. So it's terrible to write a book about a city and then the city changes under your book. So of course the book was redundant, and I started the book again. So the emergence of the book was the emergence of the city from sort of 9/11 through Hurricane Sandy. And in this time, this city that we knew as this Robert Moses city, the city of cars, where, when Moses built the city, he made the best views of the city from the Triborough Bridge, sort of approaches through, with a car. Those were the best views of the city. The city for Moses was sort of laid bare before you. Manhattan was to be enjoyed from inside a moving vehicle. It wasn't the walking city. He didn't like particularly walking himself. He didn't drive a car himself. He always had a chauffeur. He didn't know how to drive. But there was this incredibly connected city that Moses built that was the city in the sense of the future. But Moses' city was a car city. Jane Jacobs, who emerged in the 1950s, a very influential presence in the village, became the sort of the walking, the human scale, shall we say, embodiment of New York's possibility. And so it was that tension of the city that I was sort of exploring when the last sort of 8 years, climate change began to really impact how we think about coastal cities. And so the city of the last, I would say, 8 years has been really sort of a rethinking of Moses, in the sense that Moses is not all about the bad guy Moses. Really, if Moses hadn't done what he did in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing today. So that rethinking of Moses's contributions, along with what Bloomberg has done, which is was to reclaim certain things that Moses made, that Moses had sort of disconnected, which is Moses built these roads on the waterfronts of the city. So Moses cut people away from the waterfront. He built the Bronze Queens Expressway, the West Side Highway. They made all the big, what did I say? The BQE. Yeah, I don't drive, so I'm like the peak. So yeah, he basically built all the highways that cut people away from the water. And so the city of Moses was was a interconnected city of boroughs, but it was not a maritime city. It was not this archipelago that we live in. We never felt we could access the water. But Bloomberg City is an entirely new city. It's a city of the water. He made possible this access to the water that was unprecedented. It's a new city, and it's a fascinating city because at no point in New York's history prior to this last 10 years have we been able to actually enjoy a sense that New York is a waterbound city. So I got really fascinated by this idea that we are an archipelago. It's not something that I experienced when I first came here because I lived around Tompkins Square Park, and I always wanted, I knew there was water somewhere, but nothing in my life going to NYU and, you know, living in Tompkins Square Park and hanging around the village ever got me to the water, and I just thought it was very far away. New York is incredibly provincial. For those of you from London, I'm sure I have no idea of the provincialities of Londoners, but in New York, if you live in a certain area, you probably go 4 square blocks. That's already being rather expansive about your worldview, but pretty much. And then anything after that, you know, because I know a lot of people down who live around New York, around NYU, have never been to the water. They have no clue what the river is. They've never been to the West Side Highway and the water park in the West. It's quite impressive. That sort of provinciality, which is what again fascinated me about writing about an island city like New York. So my book is really about thinking about island cities. I think they're very peculiar. They're very peculiar ecologies. This city is very interesting because it's 5 boroughs connected by water. And if you look at maps of the city in 1895, they're old posters, they're fascinating posters, and I should have dug some of them up for this, but you'll see some of these old posters. They're filled with ferries connecting the east side. You know, there's about like 100 ferry lines, and I was fascinated by that because like you could go anywhere around from the north side of Manhattan to Jersey or to eastern. It was all about water connectivity. But in our time, the only way to get to Brooklyn is to head to IKEA and have sort of that free ride or pay and go, you know, it's occasional, but you have to make an effort to get to certain points in the city where you can catch a ferry. But it's an effort. It's not about shortening your commute by just taking a boat across, which was how it was 100 years ago. And this fascinated me that indeed there was this archipelagic New York. I think I'm pronouncing the word wrong. It's archipelagic. But in any case, I like the sound of the archipelagic. It's more expressive of what we are as a city because New York is not Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island. It's also about all these tiny little islands in the Jamaica Bay, and there's City Island, and there's Rikers Island, there's Ward Island, there's Hart Island. There's an incredible logic of islands that Governor's Island, which was out of reach in terms of civilian access till about 2005. And so this has been this incredible kind of richness in New York. I think that we sort of lost the opportunity to inhabit because we had that Robert Moses city, the city of the car, which then was a very concrete territorial city, a city that was land-bound. And I do think Bloomberg has opened up a different relationship to the city. So I started writing the end of my book because of Hurricane Sandy. Before that, I was going to the Far Rockaways. I'm a beach bum. I grew up in Dar es Salaam. I went to school in Santa Barbara. I love the beach. I missed the Pacific when I came to New York, but no one told me this is the place for a beach bum. It's got the greatest beaches in the world, New York City, if you're willing to take the train for $2. You know, there's Jacob Riis Park, there's Colonial, there's Far Rockaway, there's all of these beaches by train. So I got fascinated by the fact that there was all this water. There was all this access to a certain kind of oceanic sensibility, which New York is so much about. And Le Corbusier had this wonderful line, the maritime sky of Manhattan. And I just loved this idea because in what he says in one of his essays is, If you're crossing, say, 14th Street, and you look up any avenue, any of the avenues, he says, this is uniquely New York, uniquely Manhattan, which is you look up at the avenue, and what you see is this block of sky coming right down. And I just find that like the most extravagant view. You know, I just get such a thrill looking at that view that Corbusier talks about, because he says in Europe, you know, any major boulevard always arrives at a destination. There's always a, you know, some kind of so Arc de Triomphe or the Place de la Concorde, or some sort of a, you know, ceremonial vista that you're arriving at. But New York is completely artificial. It was built on a grid, it was flattened, and it was built with this kind of arrogance. And so what you have is this brutal like view, and that to me was very exciting, because this made New York a city I'd never lived in before. This was a new kind of city. The city that is probably the best documented city in the world, because, you know, I came from cities that were very old, whether it was Cochin, which is, you know, 500 years old, and much older than that, and other cities. So I was curious, but why should someone care about writing about New York? It's so overwritten anyway. And what I discovered is that because New York was such an artificial city, it was also the best documented city in terms of the people who crafted the city into a built environment. It's completely an experiment in human possibility. And what excited me was that no one had claims to this city. This is a city that had, in a way, a tradition that was more in sympathy with a city like Siena, and I forget some of the other cities in Europe that were known as open cities, cities of refuge. You know, that if you know, in medieval cities, there were certain cities in Europe, if you were persecuted, you could go to the city and you would not be sent away. And New York became, in the New World, the city of refuge. People could leave Europe if they were persecuted. They knew, they didn't know where it was. It was 3 months a boat ride away, but it was called New York. And if they just got there, if they survived all those diseases and the terrible journey, they just might be safe. And so this fascinating idea of the refuge city was a city that compelled me. And so I started writing with this refuge city, and I started talking about New York in those terms. This was the city that was an open city. I was writing about the open city at a time when Giuliani was sort of closing down doors in many ways, in civic sense. And there was a feeling of being really sort of claustrophobic in the Giuliani towards the end, and I was sort of thinking about how this is an open city, but the experience we have in New York right now is feeling of constriction, and you know what that was about. So I'm going to start off in a way, I'm starting off with the end of my book, and I'm going to lead you into the book. This is one of my favorite spots in New York. It's called Broad Channel. You have to take the A train all the way to the end, and then you get off in the middle of nowhere en route to Far Rockaway. Now this place was completely washed off under Hurricane Sandy. It did not exist because there were like actual boats that were considerably inland, and the whole the causeway through which the trains get to the Rockaways, because the Rockaways are barrier islands, completely destroyed for 8 months. People travel for like 5 hours to get from the Rockaways into the city. It's a very impoverished. Moses built some of those high rises in the distance, Rockaways. What he did was he was very organized. He hid away poverty. He built like nice big housing far away from the city for the urban poor, so that, you know, he didn't have to sort of deal with it. So the Rockaways have spectacular views, but they are inhabited in many ways by the people who need to be much closer to the city and who can't actually enjoy the views. But this particular place is very special to me, because it is nothing but like a railway and these new barriers that have been built under Bloomberg to prevent, you know, it's storm surge barriers. So these are artificial, but they're planning to do something about it, so that next time the storm surge occurs again, you do not have this terrible situation of the track being washed away. So this is the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. It was built by Robert Moses, yeah? You just correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I've got my facts quite. A spectacular view. But when I see this, I I chose this view because this is a view that I live downtown. I always look at this view, and it makes me think about this archipelagic New York, this New York that opens itself to the sea. It's really quite a spectacular New York. And when I was writing my book, it was 2009, it was 400 years of 1609 when Henry Hudson came up the river. And this is the Helverman, the model of the Helverman, the ship in which Henry Hudson came up. This is a totally, this is an incredible moment when you have this like ghost-like ship, and it's the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge, and it's totally surreal. It's like the Helverman 400 years later under this New York of the future. But this was what my book was about. It's sort of the past and the present, and Eric Sanderson has this wonderful project called the Manhattan Project, which is all about layering. You start with the bedrock of an idea, and he starts off with sort of the British military map of 1740s, I forget it was, and he builds up to tell us what Manhattan was like 400 years ago, 300 years ago, 200 years ago. So you begin to get a sense of like what was in Times Square before, 400 years ago, what was down in the Village 400 years ago. And so this layer palimpsest New York is a New York that I got fascinated by, and I sort of had been doing that for 10, 12 years while writing the book. But the Helverman sort of clarified what that weird project of back and forth is about when you're writing about a city, particularly a city that is very hard. You can never know a city entirely. It's very hard as a situationist, show us. It's psychogeography. So it's really about how do you map the city of the future, but sort of thinking of the city of the past. My interest in New York, because I live here, is very much haunted by the places I've been in. As I said, I'm from East Africa, from Tanzania. My parents live in Cochin, and I kept thinking, why am I so comfortable in New York when I'm downtown? It was about having been here before, and it was only when I'd done the work that I understood that the reason I could fit in here is because the urban planning of the Dutch that shaped the early New Amsterdam. It's the same geography that shaped the early Kaapstad, which is Cape Town, the early Cochin, which is where my parents live. These are all old Dutch ports from the VOC period, the Dutch East India Company. They had over 600 ports, and they built the early infrastructure of many places around Asia and Africa, and I just happened to have lived in many of these places. And so what I didn't know was that New Amsterdam was part of that logic and was actually built after many of these Asian cities, of which my parents live in one of them. So I got very interested in connecting the story of New York to its actual hauntings, and through administrative offices, through colonial policies, and through slaves, through to these various 600 ports. And so my book started tracing that. And I began with looking at Van Boons's maps. And I don't know if any of you have seen Van Boons's map, but Van Boons was an amazing illustrator, painter, Dutch. I believe he never left Amsterdam. I love the Dutch. They never leave, and they have these amazing imaginations. He drew pretty much all the maps of the 600 ports. And we had an incredible exhibition in 2009 where they brought some of these maps, and that's when I just absolutely went to town, because they had maps of towns that I'd been in, Zanzibar and Cochin and Cape Town, and I was beginning to make sense of why New York was so interesting to me, not in a linear way, but in a way that was beginning to make sense through Sanderson's idea of the palimpsest, sort of building up layers. This is Van Boons's map. This is a map of Manhattan, right? So you have the Noor River. So you have Manhattan right here. Well, I should, is this the thing that I can use? Okay, so you see, yes? That's that's where Skyscraper Museum is, right there where the windmill is, just around there. That's Governor's Island. This is Brooklyn. That's Noor River, Staten Island. So this is the earliest extant map of the kind of infrastructure of early Manhattan. The people go back to, if you want to know where things were, where the windmill was, where was the city hall, you know, that sort of thing. Where was the Negro burial grounds? We tend to go back to this map and look closer at it. This is a very influential map. It was Van Boons who drew this map. But he also drew maps about other places. This is a map of Batavia, which is modern Jakarta, which was colonized way earlier and was the destination if you were Dutch and if you're an explorer. You probably wanted to go to a cool place with a lot of partying and a lot of luxury and easy to live place, which is Batavia. Certainly not a little beaver town. New Amsterdam, which was very shoddy and was very uncomfortable and very far. So this was like a major destination, and so was Cochin, where my parents are from. And in every one of these illustrations, what fascinated me was the sense of arrival, this kind of festive arrival of the, you know, of the Dutch onto the scene of their colonial outpost, shall we say. So I began to sort of trace this journey because the images I've shown you is of the maritime journeys around the world. You know, the Dutch would go from Asia, from Jakarta, through the Malacca Straits to India, to move to East Africa and South Africa, and then over to the Americas. So this weird journey was one that the Dutch did all the time, and along with that, they carried, you know, spices, clothes, slaves, ideas, notions of stock exchange and democracy and building public pathways. You know, they shared notions of what a street should look like and certain urban planning ideas, and this they built along the way wherever they went. So this is the early urban trace that you will see on Stone Street and Water Street. And when you're downtown, all the way downtown, you know the early Dutch pathways are lost, but we have these existing early maps. That allow us to reimagine what that might have been like. This is an illustration of Cochin, but what I want to share with you is how it resonated with, you know, the illustrations of New York. There was this kind of replica, this sort of, I've been here before, I've seen this before. It's a genre thing, but there's then a genre of having occupied spaces in these cities. You know, it's like you feel like you've been there before and never been there because something connects with the geography of it. Now this is a shot I took of the great insignia of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. You know, they were a major corporation in the 1600s. But this is from South Africa. When I was visiting Cape Town, I took a shot of it. It's on the fort. They embossed this on every fort they had. The fort down in New Amsterdam would have had the same insignia. So I took a shot of this because it's a very unsettling, if you are from one of these colonies, a very unsettling, what do you say, an insignia? A symbol? Yes. So I was thinking, like, okay, how's my book going to be different from Rem Koolhaas's book and, you know, the book of Pete Hamill and Jackson and all the great writers of New York, because you're competing here with some serious names. If you're writing about New York, you know, you shouldn't have such hubris, but if you do take it on, you have to question that. And I realized I was writing about this Cape of Good Hope, New York, this New York of like the Southern Hemisphere's take on New York, and that is my favorite shot. This is the tip of Cape of Good Hope, and you know when the Indian Ocean meets the Atlantic. That's the force point. That's the Atlantic, and that's the Indian Ocean, and they're meeting right there. And it's just like this incredible crucible of like power. It's this very interesting point. And the Dutch, they were really into these kind of places. They built forts wherever they went, but they picked really good spots. This is one of the places the Dutch, you know, lived in South Africa. They built a Fort Kaapstad. The same time they built Fort New Amsterdam. So it was this is kind of interesting synchrony between early urban planning of the Dutch with the emergence of New York. The early New York, as many of you know, was very waterbound. It was very tiny, and it ends in Wall Street, and it starts and the Battery Park, where we are now, it's all on landfill, but it's pretty much in the area of the imagination of this very early New York, a New York that was very much bound by water. And my book then began to sort of retrace sites like Broad Street, which was a pier. They used to call it a slip, right? The slips went inside and the piers went outwards. Very interesting, but those are sort of inland water ways so that the boats could park. But now Broad Street is the broadest street downtown because it was an old waterway. It's kind of fascinating. So this idea of writing a book over time was something that sort of emerged as I've lived here for a while, but it was something that Sanderson was also doing at the same time with this Manhattan project. And this map is fascinating because I started taking this map, started studying this really closely because I started a theater company because I wanted to work with water. So we started working with water. Said my collaborator Mcgrath Dessau's here. We've done a lot of water projects together. We perform in different sides of water. But this is fascinating because it gives you a sense of what the topography was, like 400 years ago. It's the only existing map, because it was a military map, of like where the hills were, where the swamps were, where the waterways were, where the traces were, And it's fascinating because of this map. This is Veely's map. Colonel Veely was the engineer who built Central Park's plumbing. He was a sanitation guy. He built all the waterways. By the time he finished this map, this city did not exist. It was completely macadam. Was built over. So this is a beautiful map. This map is about all that water stuff, all the the marsh, like the Alphabet City marsh, and the Bowery, where the swamps are, where the wetlands are, all of that stuff that's hidden now underground is all on this map. And so it's really one of the most fascinating maps we have of New York, and so when you put them all together, it's intriguing. So I started writing about this New York of these various layers. These are maps from my book. And I'm fascinated here. I worked with an architect, Daniel Hedix, who made these maps for me. But we started playing with perspective. And one of the things about New York's river, the Hudson River, which is a fascinating river, we just sort of switched it for a certain kind of visual perspective and effect, is that the Hudson is actually a very mystical river. It used to be called the river that flows both ways. The Native Americans called it that because it has 4 tides. It goes up and down, goes up twice and comes down twice. The river that flows both, because of the shape of the river. And this is a really intriguing rhythm. Apparently there are certain rivers in the world that have this, and the Hudson River is one of them. And this idea of the river that flows both ways was an idea that greatly sort of inspired me to write about this river that was of such importance in the 19th century and became the 1970s this major source of environmental legislation, the Clean Water Act, but that in our time, people forget the battles that went into saving the Hudson River, but also the fact that we still need to learn from the Hudson River, that we need to keep saving it, But it's not just the Hudson, because there are many rivers in India that can learn from the Hudson River. So for me, the Hudson River is this incredible sort of place to sort of go back to for ideas about how we live as a river city. As I said, the archipelago of New York has a very particular identity because it has this river city identity. So it's a very particular kind of identity because it's an identity dependent on the cities that live further upstream and the fact that we're a major hub downstream. And now with the whole question of fracking, that question is really coming to play in a big way, saying we're really an interdependent ecology all the way up the Hudson River. We have to care about what happens hundreds of miles upstream because that's going to affect us down here. This idea really played itself out over Hurricane Sandy because numerous sewage sewage tanks, around New York sort of spilled over, they broke, there was a lot of sewage waste spilled over. And the whole question of how far that spill affected many different communities. It wasn't just New York, it was New Jersey as well, and it was also upstream and downstream. So this idea of interdependency, if you live in a river city, is something that I think has come to play in new ways for us, really driving home this idea of this archipelagic sensation. In 2002, a friend of mine, Brian Mcgrath, did a beautiful video project called Timeline. It's actually spectacular. It has to be seen on a video, but it drew home for me the challenge of writing about New York, because he starts off with the Brooklyn Bridge and does this timeline of the emergence of high-rises in New York's timeline history, where you have the Woolworth building coming up by the 1930s, and then going up to the 1990s. So this sort of timeline was visually a very interesting breakdown for me about the emergence of the vertical city. The city that's a city of islands, a city that's hemmed in by a very finite boundary, the island of Manhattan, but a city that's also, transformed through time in a way that one does not see frequently. One doesn't think about it because one is absorbed inside the entrails of the city. So this is downtown. When you put all of those images on the prior. When you put these different developments together, you get this very integrated city of the subways and the roads and the high-rises and the landfills, and you get this built city, the city that's entirely artificial. So getting back to sort of thinking about fluid New York, what I did was create a map of New York without any signs, because one of the things when we look at maps, particularly maps in New York, I'm always looking for Brooklyn or Queens or something like that. I'm always looking for a place. In New Yorkers are very driven. We want to just get things done. But once I pulled out the names, I suddenly started looking at this area here. I got very interested. I said, oh God, that's New York too. And what are those islands? I've never been there. How do you get there? How do you get to these little islands? There are all these sort of things that float up, because I'm not completely dazzled by Manhattan or swallowed up by Staten Island's geography. So looking at these small places, and that's what got me to start writing about this ecological city, the city of water. This is Broad Channel again. And I started exploring the city, and around the time I started writing about New York, right after 9/11, there was a discovery downtown of the African burial ground. This was a hidden, there's 20,000 African Americans buried between Wall Street and Canal Street, because in the old days under the Dutch and the British, if you were of African descent, you were not allowed to be buried within the city walls. This was true of the African Americans, but this was also true of Jewish New Yorkers who first came here, and they said, well, we don't really want to be buried with you anyway, and they set up their own burial grounds, which is the one, the St. James Place is the first one, and then there's another one. The second one is around 11th Street, and they still exist. They're quite fascinating to see. But this was just when they dug it up, so I was really intrigued by this incredible resonance of water, because the first African Americans, the African descent peoples to arrive in Manhattan arrived shortly in 1625, and they are Portuguese-speaking Angolans who were brought on Dutch ships. So they are like held in Brazil. They're coming from Angola. And so Dutch will bring them to New York as a Dutch New York. And I was thinking, hey, this is fascinating, because the first group of Europeans here all speak French and Flemish. They're not speaking English. And the slaves are coming speaking Portuguese. So it's like a real hodgepodge of people who know, these are people from all over the place. And so this was a fascinating sort of layering of this incredible hidden history of New York that started rising to the surface, because I happen to be from Africa. I was just sort of fascinated by this early history of Africa that was sort of coming up around this time, because the burial ground that is now established. It took them a lot of fighting to get that. They had 20,000 people, and they wanted a memorial, but they couldn't get the funding for it. But meanwhile, because the World Trade Center was such a major site, we had this huge footprint for over 3,000 people, and there was this kind of conversation of which tragedy is worse, so which one is worth remembering more. It's kind of this kind of hideous conversation that eventually steered away from that. But the question of the African burial ground became very contentious. So around that time, of course, the future of Coney Island was in great question. As you know, Coney Island's been dying for a long time. The future of Coney Island, in a way, is the future of New York, because if you were to arrive from Europe on a ship, the first island you would see would be Coney Island, Rabbit Island, which is Coney Island. The Dutch called it Coney Island because it's full of rabbits. And it was a barrier island, and then they landfilled it. So it's far bigger now than it was. It used to be like strips, and so Coney Island is this really interesting place, and Rem Koolhaas really did a great job in sort of showing us how to think about Coney Island. But when I started documenting Coney Island, it was already dying, and there were tremendous efforts. People, it was their home, these people's homes, and Related had a big project for Coney Island, and there were, I think, Trump had big projects, and so there were all these projects that would have greatly transformed these people's lives, and have transformed these people's lives since the 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is when all of these conversations are going on. So I started documenting, these lives of people for whom Coney Island isn't just a destination carnival place, but a place, of generations, of living there. This is the Mermaid Parade. Again, very much retracing, the waterbound nature of the city. Very, very, very interesting in terms of how much the city is filled with landfill, but the water-bound nature of the city is one that is recreated by the kind of rituals of New York. There are many ways in which New York's water-bound, I call them hauntings or ghostings, but is very much in the built environment. I think that's Neptune. So there are all these like water beings, if you go on Mermaid Parade, that just sort of haunt you. This is, of course, the gay pride, and this one image is an image I write about in my book. I live in the West Village, and I love the idea of angels walking around. It's just so cool to see this completely, hit gold lame shoes, and it was just so West Village, but also so hopeful in a way, because it's hard to live in New York, and then you see something beautiful and you go, oh, yeah, that's why I'm living in New York. This is so beautiful, because if you really were to think about it, it's such a bad idea to live in New York. It's incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult, but this is these are the different chapters of my book that I'm showing images of that didn't make it into my book. This is, of course, the day when Obama was coming to town, and people were so excited, and it was such a festive moment in Washington Square. People were very, very expressive about their sensations. I have a chapter on Gandhi, and my book is very much Gandhi's New York, not because of Gandhi, but because he was a walking guy. I'm into walking people like Thoreau and Gandhi, and people who walk, and Jane Jacobs, and I love seeing Gandhi in the winter because he's got barely anything on, and it's just so dramatic, and it's it's just such a contrast. But he also reminds me that New York is about this kind of ecumenical place. It's a place of the open city, the city, of a certain kind of internationalism that's very interesting. And it's interesting not because of consumption, which is what most people think New York's about, but it's about this like deeply you know, New York is a very philosophical place, right? People come here for different reasons, live here in ways that are very Gandhian. You have to be really frugal to live in New York, incredibly self-reflexive. And I think there's a lot more Gandhi in New York, in New York than I would have realized, you know, before coming here. And of course, it makes sense. They have a statue of him here. There's also, I think, that's Spider-Man, right? So you can find just the strangest people in New York, depending on the day you walk around. This is the New York that I got very excited. It's Amanda Burton's New York. It's Bloomberg's New York. It's Summer Street's New York. And gosh, Summer Street, what an opportunity to drive on places and cycle to places that you could never do otherwise. But I got excited about that New York, the New York of the car, you know, Robert Moses' New York, the New York of, you know, heavy traffic that you could then traverse and see the city in ways that, you know, you wouldn't otherwise imagine. And I'm not a runner, but but living here, I've become so fascinated with running because of the marathon. So I started going to the marathon for 20 years. I go and watch this marathon, and it's so exciting. I always try to catch the first pack. But the marathon is incredible because of its vistas and because of what it does to the city, transform the city into this other kind of place. And what is that place? That place is a place of habitation. This is a map in my book of you know, 2 planes fell in the Hudson River, and I live on the waterfront, so this issue of planes falling in the river is not very funny when you see the planes sort of going by. So I did some work on the Hudson River and wondering, like, what's with the planes and why are the planes like so low? And it turns out there's like 20,000 planes flying on the Hudson River pathway, and I got very interested with this question of, you know, flows in the city. So you see, I'm building the city up in this kind of sedimentation way. And so I started dealing with the city of flows. This is the city of the swimming city of New York. You know, one of the things about New York is that now you can swim in the water. The water was toxic for many, many years, and by the 1990s you could swim around New York, and that was always a sign of how healthy it was. Of course, you really shouldn't be, because you know there's been all these sewage spills, but we're not going to talk about that. You can still swim in New York. But the New York I wrote about is how this New York of circumlocution was this kind of new kind of New York. This is Governor's Island, and when Governor's Island opened up to New Yorkers, it became this really interesting place, and my company, we started doing pieces on the island. But what really interests me is how this idea of the maritime New York, the New York of the waterways, is slowly coming back. I'm coming to the end of my talk, and what I want to show you now is just sort of images I took on October 29th. It was the anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, so I went back to the Rockaways. And, you know, because of the causeway had just opened up like 2 months before. It had been closed for 8 months. So you couldn't get there even if you wanted to, unless you drove. But with public transportation, you could only go there. So it's still all sort of really, it was at the time still under construction and boarded up. There was this kind of massive recovery going on. But there's this very interesting street in Rockaway, in the Rockaway Park side, called Beach 116. It's a very odd place, because on one hand is the site where the plane fell a couple of years ago and a whole bunch of people died, Flight 587. And on the other side, a tribute park where we did a performance, is a tribute to 9/11, because 300 of the Far Rockaway residents are buried in this area, because they're from this area. They're all firefighters. So this kind of very heavy feeling kind of street, 116, very cool place. Really, if you're looking for a good beach to swim, it's a beautiful place, but it's also got all this incredible memory. So I went there many times. We did a performance there. I don't remember, Margaret, if you joined us that time, but it was a very beautiful place to do a piece, very dramatic. But I also went to because it was this particular site, the Tribute Park site, was completely destroyed. It was all washed away. This is brand new, opened on October 29th, you know, because it was reconstructed. And this was a sanitation site which spilt all the sewage all around New York. This was the place that broke. This was right at the Rockaways. So this was all very interesting because, as you know, Bloomberg was very efficient. He actually had a lot of things in place to respond to the situation. And I was fascinated by the dunes that were blocking the ocean on the other side. They started replacing, building new dunes, because that's the whole part of the resiliency project, is to create new barriers. But also in the case of Far Rockaway, because of the spill of the sewage, apparently it was like entirely filled with fecal matter, waste, and garbage. I mean, it was just like hideous. It was all like embossed on the landscape, and it took a massive cleanup effort. So this sort of sand was like replacing the original, and also extending the beach forward. So this kind of massive restructuring of the landscape of New York, which is going to happen right across New York and has to happen before the next storm, is part of what is interesting me at the moment, is how do we respond to storm surge as an island city? What are some of the challenges? But what interested me going October 29th back there and talking to some of the people was this kind of, in just my bafflement that no one had any plans to leave. That, a lot of them lost a lot of money because they had these businesses that were, it's 8 feet of water. All the storage of all the business stuff, all the commercial stuff was washed away, it was destroyed. I mean, it was just, Beach 116 is fascinating. It's built like a bowl. The bowl, the ocean side is high and the bay side is low. So if the ocean comes in, it fills up in the bay, just sort of goes down. I'm not describing this very well, but it's like this. So that's the ocean, that's the bay, and the whole water came, so it washed everything out. So it was just so dramatic. I couldn't imagine this. And so this is all shots of Beach 116. It's just a fascinating little street. And talking about resiliency, because I was so affected by Hurricane Sandy personally as well, I was very moved to see how people were just sort of holding their ground, just fighting back. I don't identify with fighting nature on those terms. Sometimes you must listen to nature a little bit and realize that maybe you could lose. Like, you can't fight nature. It's not like come get me kind of thing. But I think for people in Far Rockaways, it's very much about fighting nature. It's sort of like, we're not moving, we're staying right here. But they are barrier islands. They're not built to be inhabited. And certainly not till this century. So there's a kind of a certain kind of logic there that's kind of a little, it's precarious. So there were a lot of fighting words that day in Hurricane Sandy, the anniversary of Hurricane Sandy. And I spoke to quite a few people there because they're still building the dunes, and a lot of people building the dunes are from there. So we've been here 3 generations. It's interesting when people talk about generations because there's such an investment in place and in emotions. There's this kind of provisionality. This is all dunes being built, so it's very provisional. This is the flight, the flight memorial. But I thought its words were very uncanny for the place. So I took my train back, the A train back, and at Broad Channel, people are picnicking right on the rocks, and it's so Broad Channel-ish, people just sort of hanging out on the subway and just on the tracks and just fishing, and I thought that's just so New York, that's why New York is so crazy and interesting. People do strange things, having picnic right there, and I thought that is just so Far Rockaway. Of course, it's fabulous and super dangerous, and it's great. So people just, that the train was just hurtling right by. And so, I have this theater company, and we work with water, and what we do is we work with communities in different water sites, in different places in the world, wherever we can do work. So we did a project with a tribute park in the Rockaways on the anniversary of Hurricane Sandy. It's such an incredible spot because that's Manhattan right there. And, this is part of New York, but it's the extremities of New York. You never go to Rockaways unless you want to surf or you just want to go because it's so interesting. But it is far. we were just really into the water that day. It was just so cool. But then there were some really cool people who lived there. They're probably the original inhabitants of Manhattan, you know, the ones on. That's probably how we're going to. We all have to get one of these things so we can, when things get really bad, we should start commuting that way. And I thought they were just so futuristic about their choices. It's like dad, mom, and the kid is heading towards Manhattan, but the choice of transport was something I didn't know how to do. But so I really was very excited to see that. And I'm going to end with this image that I love. It's such a beautiful image, and it's the lost New York. It's the New York we all love, you know. I don't know why they didn't save this image in Coney Island. Why did they have to just tear everything and take it all apart? But this is such an, what's his name? I forget his name. This is famous, you know, the trip to the moon guy.
Oh, Melis.
Yes, Melis. Yeah, it's right. It's a director, and it's got a like a stage name for this particular image of New York. But thank you. And so this is a New York that doesn't exist anymore, but it's yeah. So thanks very much.
We have some questions.
Yes, Bob.
Could you describe one of your dance? I mean, it would be interesting to see one. I'd love to see one, but how long they are, what happens in them, and how you conceive of them.
Right. Well, we pick sites. So we'll pick a site because of its historical importance, like say Governor's Island, but the historical site, the original site, the site that was, because you know, like say 80% of Governor's Island is landfill. So I went looking for a beach, like the original beach. You know, there's not much beach, but so we'll pick like a site, and then from that we'll work with each person's. But mostly we respond to the landscape, and depends on the site. For instance, the piece I did in Cape of Good Hope, I worked with the Cape Malay community who had never been allowed to the water under apartheid. Under apartheid, and I didn't know this, if you were if you were black or colored as they call them, the Malay and Asians, you couldn't access the water. The beaches are fantastic, the most incredible beaches in the world, but no one was allowed near the beach for miles, and they were originally living by the water, and they were displaced in the 1930s, taken into the hinterland. So we did a project there where we did performance there because they'd never been allowed there before. So there's resonance with the site. And the project I did in Cochin, so I'll pick a site that's, you know, washed out by the tsunami, and the neighborhood is, you know, Muslims and untouchables, and we'll do work about, you know, the ecumenical nature of that site. So each site has its own feel. In New York, there's so many reasons to do things, you know. Christopher Street, we've done project Far Rockaway because of Hurricane Sandy. We do Governor's Island because it's just so fun to do something in Governor's Island anyway, but it's also rich in history. Governor's Island has ghosts. This year I'm hoping to do a piece in Governor's Island inside the prison, the 1811 prison. Very cool. So I hope they let me, I don't know, but yeah, the theater thing is about, I'll tell you, the reason I do the theater is because there's so much New York has that it shares with Japan, with so many cities right now in terms of storm surge. So my pieces are all about storm surge. You know, the piece I did a couple of years ago on Governor's Island was about the Japanese tsunami, and the piece we're doing this year is called Tacloban because of the Philippines. But we're thinking through ideas. You know, it's got these ominous names, but people don't even know where Rikuzen-Takata is. But Rikuzen-Takata was this town that was completely wiped out in the Japanese tsunami. The only thing remaining was this. It was a city, and the only thing remaining was a tree. It was just so extreme. So, you know, New York, we share a lot with a lot of island cities, and it's my way of just sort of exploring the ideas, the theoretical ideas about this, you know, through performance. But it's also a way of I think a lot of my people in my company, people from New York who just love to inhabit the space, the built environment. It's such an opportunity not to be, you know, I'm shopping, I'm going to work, I'm, you know, I'm like doing something, right? You're sort of enjoying the city, so it has that kind of everydayness. But I'd like to sort of close by remarking on the super talls and the super rich and the super billionaire New York that we're having, because my neighborhood, our neighborhood is very super billionaire New York also. Is this kind of thing that this sense I have of this? Okay, it's interesting. The buildings are gorgeous, but you know what's happening in London is sort of some kind of emptying out of the city. So there are all these, people who live in the Woolworth building, so it's like 2 occupants in the top floors or the top 4 floors, because they're just there once a year, maybe once every 2 years or something. So this kind of emptying out of New York that's going on, certainly in our neighborhood. It's easy to find parking these days. That's the giveaway. It's like, oh, it's only 1 person dwelling, but it's like 2 blocks for a Texan guy's daughter, it's just her townhouse or something. But there's this kind of transformation that's a little bit unsettling. And one of the things I tell my students is that, I like rich people. But particularly those in the 1930s and 40s, they would support the arts. They built museums, they built galleries, they put a lot back in infrastructure, some of the wonderful buildings in New York. There was all this stuff, done by Robert Barons and a lot of others. There was a great pride in culture, in like giving back to the city, the federal funding. There's all this kind of incredible wealth for the other Philip Morrises, it's a certain amount of putting back in the city. But the billionaires that we have in the last 10 years, this is like a different breed. Like, I don't know of any major building that came out of some, this kind of incredible wealth. You would think there would be like a huge renaissance in like new digital art, or, I don't know, some kind of new cultural thing that would happen, And I just feel like the patronage that New York was so known for. That's what's exciting. New York, there was such an incredible civic life. We still have it, but considering the wealth of New York, we don't have the kind of civic investment that's befitting a great city. That's my feeling, because I'm in the arts, and most of my, I see the disparity between, the great potential of New York and the great abundance of talent of New York, but not the kind of investment in this kind of infrastructural New York that was so that made New York very special in some ways. I mean, I'm being cliche, but I'm thinking of like, Jacqueline Kennedy, New York, that New York, the New York where you cared about something. It sounds very silly, but it is this kind of when people felt that they had to put something back to the city in a big way, so they would give a sign of some kind. But thank you. You have the opportunity to buy a book, of course, but also I'm going to quickly pour some water or wine and see the exhibition, or ask me questions individually.